Verna, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you.
It's been a long time coming. We've known each other for a very, very, very long time. We've known several lifetimes, I feel. So one question I had for you, the first question I had for you is, what drives you today, apart from your daughter? That would have been an easy answer.
You took my easy answer, didn't you? I think I was having a conversation with a friend about this, and you just spoke about different lifetimes, and it feels like when you go through your different lifetimes, you'll find that you've been driven maybe by different things, your aspirations were different. You know, what I prioritized when I was in my 20s, as you would know, is no longer quite the same. But I think if there is one thing that I have very recently learned is the purpose of what I'm meant to do is just growth. And I think as I look back over the years, some of which you know, and I think of all the mistakes you make and you think, what were you thinking there and why would you make those decisions? Looking back, it feels like all of those things have been driving towards you discovering yourself and growing and figuring things out. And somebody said something to me recently, because I think we've all been through this realization that we're learning the same lessons over and over again, and you don't seem to be coming out of a rut. And then somebody said, well, as long as you don't learn the lesson, you'll still be taught the same things over and over and over again. And I think that's kind of the thing that has changed in my mindset these days, is that instead of seeing things as a setback or why is this happening again, just like, okay, there's a lesson to be learned here. And I have a good friend of mine who kind of likes to guide. And so she said to me once, at the worst possible moment, she said, when something bad happens, say thank you. And I was like, are you kidding me? Like, you're not motivated to say thank you at that point. But I've come to do that. I've come to say thank you when things happen, because I think the whole purpose is to learn and to grow.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned that, because I had a very interesting conversation with someone yesterday, and she said to me, and that kind of like brought a tear to my eye, and she said, how often do you look at yourself in the mirror and you say, thank you, I forgive you, and I love you? We don't say that often to each other, to ourselves, I don't think. And I think that what you mentioned about growth, on a kind of deeper, more spiritual level, I think we choose this. We choose to have this, in the moment it feels like a challenge, it feels painful, it feels, as you said, why is this happening to me? But I think at a deeper level, we choose to go through this experience. And it's amazing that, as you said, in our 20s, I don't think we would have been ready to have this thought process.
No.
Yeah. So when you look back at your studies, you read literature and English at university, and looking at what you do now, do you think that was a natural evolution, or was it an organic development of where your career was meant to?
You see, it doesn't really look like it. And I've been through different universes almost. To be fair, going into the whole literature thing, like, you were passionate about literature, I was passionate about literature, and my whole thing at the time was, I didn't even think very much further about what I was going to do with it. All I knew is that's what I love to do and that's what I'm going to do. Whether it means I write books or I read them or I edit them, it was always going to be about that. But that's the wonderful thing about growth, right? When you're going in, you don't know what you're going to learn. And once I got into literature, what happened was I found the things that I was passionate about. So political writing, identity issues, race, gender, sexuality, those are all the things that spoke to me. And I thought, I like the literature, I like the technicality of it, I like the artistry of it, but I also like that part of literature that is crafting a message, an important message, that is about representation, that's about giving a voice to the voiceless. So that was kind of my driving thing as I was going through different steps of my career. And I think while I've been through different things, so I've been in higher education, I've worked in property a little bit, I've worked in political communication, and now I'm working in pretty much corporate communication, but mostly public affairs. The driving line doesn't necessarily come out, but to me it's always been the same thing. It's always been giving a voice. It's always been writing. Writing has always been at the center of everything that I've done. And that's what motivated me in reading literature, is trying to make the world a better place. Right now, I evolve in a corporate environment where trying to make the world a better place isn't exactly the motto. But there are things to be done everywhere, I think. I think there are things to be done everywhere. And what literature gave me is the ability to craft a message, the ability to understand a message, and the sensitivity and the empathy to be able to hear the people in my environment. And if I can then use that in order to say something valuable, make some kind of change, advance some kind of cause, then that's, for me, that was the point. Like, that's how I see my evolution from those beginnings of liking to read Shakespeare up until now. I feel like that's what it is. Of course, there are some moments where you have to like remind yourself that there is a purpose to what you're doing. We all have those days where we wake up in the morning and you don't see the point of your job. But no, I've somehow always managed to find that purpose, at least. Yeah.
At one point, I think you either read or you taught post-colonial writing as well. Were there any particular, I mean, you said you were always passionate about certain specific issues. Presumably it was predominantly fiction. So was it something deeper that attracted you to certain specific types of genre?
As with most things, I guess some things happen by accident. So I was reading English and American Lit at Warwick, and I had been through the first 2 years of my studies, and it was all the regular things that you would know, right? So read Shakespeare, read Chaucer, read the Romantics and Jane Austen. And I was used to that stuff. It's what we read when we were at school, but obviously at a different level with different ways of reading it. And then when I got to the last year of university, which was the third year, so this was 2002 in Warwick, and it was the first time in the curriculum that they'd introduced what they called literatures in English. And it was the first time that I was to be reading in England authors that were kind of my skin color or from the continent that I come from. And so there was this whole new thing that was, well, first of all, it was literatures in English. So it was everything. It was Indian lit, it was Caribbean lit, it was African lit. And that moment where I felt, oh, like, I feel a little closer to, you know, Chinua Achebe than Shakespeare, although I love the Shakespeare, is a moment of realization. And there's a powerful moment where you feel seen and you feel represented and you feel recognized. And it just, I remember I was very emotional in those classes. In addition to the fact that I was kind of like the token brown person in class, because you're a stone's throw away from, you know, Shakespeare's birthplace in Stratford-upon-Avon. So there's not a lot of people of color in the class. And all of a sudden, you're now the subject. Like, you're talking about you, people are talking about Africa, and they're like, oh, is this how it goes in Africa? I'm like, I don't know, maybe. It's just that moment of being seen, and I think there's such value to that, to representation. So post-colonial writing for me became important because of that, because I felt represented, and all of a sudden, all of those voices that had not been represented, like, were coming out. Like, you know, the voices of women, like, I love this painting of yours.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, every time I get goosebumps, even to this day, looking at it. And when you were at school, did you do The River Between?
I did.
I mean, that's probably one of the only works that we did that was an African voice. And even I remember reading it years after school, and you see it in different eyes. You feel the pain of these women, and you realize actually, yes, it's fiction, but it's giving a voice to, as you say, to the voiceless. And also you realize the power that words can have. And I think that's what also rejoins what you're doing now. Yes. It's still, you know, I see your role, and correct me if I'm wrong, is a slightly diplomatic role as well, because you, as you said, you have to play the space between public and private sector as well.
Absolutely.
So I would have thought you have to be quite careful with your words.
Yes. And it is a space that could be used both ways, right? And it speaks to me again, because I think and it's based on where I'm coming from, but I think there is, the space of change is in the political sphere. And we're so afraid of this in Mauritius to talk about politics or to be involved in that space. And I don't want to talk about politics. I'm just talking about the space, the political space, the space where we can articulate ideas, define who we are as a people, where we want to go, what are our values, what are our ideals. And I think that's such an important place that exists, that, and this is not the only country where it's misappropriated, but it's often misappropriated. But I think that's a space that's important to speak in. Things need to be said. I work in that space between public and private sector. But the thing that I have heard from the people that I work with that comes across for me is the focus is national development. Of course, we're focused on prosperity and growing that prosperity and making sure that our country comes up from where we had origins where we were not meant to succeed when we were left on our own, as it were. We were not meant to succeed, and yet we have over 50 odd years. We have come a lot further than what was expected of us, and I think there's value in that. I think there's value in that, the drive towards development. At the same time, knowing that we will only ever progress as far as the last person of our society. So there's this whole dimension of inclusivity as well that's embedded into what we do, into what I do.
How are you getting on with that, by the way?
It's a balance that you have to strike, right? Because it's a private sector. We're working towards, these are profit-making organizations. The bottom line matters. That's always a fact. But I am seeing more and more every day that even the people for whom the bottom line matters have now come to the awareness that without inclusive growth, without inclusive development, then we'll only get so far. And I think the COVID years has done a lot to show that. Like, you can progress as much as you want, but if there are those left behind, then you will always be held back, and society as a whole will always be held back. There's a lot, I'm seeing a lot of this in my environment nowadays, of consciousness, awareness of what it means to be inclusive. Who do we need to include? Just things like, vulnerable populations, minority populations. All of those things have become now, it's part and parcel of ESGs, it's part and parcel of sustainable development as we understand it. Yes, there is a risk of paying lip service to that because those are boxes that need to be checked. But at least it's providing a space for people who actually want to affect change to be able to do that. And I think those are the spaces where I feel like I can actually bring a contribution. There's always a good fight. There's always, irrespective of the environment that you're in, there's always a good fight to be fought.
And do you feel that when we're talking about inclusivity, do you feel that things like, as we've seen in the case of women, and the statutory requirement to have at least 25% of the board of listed companies being women, do you feel that positive discrimination is a good thing?
It's a tricky one. And I think positive discrimination is a necessary step. I think to go from 0 to 100 at some point, yes, there is a point at which it's a necessary step to be made, if only to allow certain decisions to be made that would not have been made otherwise. But I think it shouldn't be taken as an end in itself. I think it needs to be a platform offered so that change can happen. But I think the real victory would be coming to a point where you don't need that quota anymore, where it's not a matter of conscious hiring, but just that's how it is, that competence, that the definitions of competence become gender neutral. And as much as we would like to say that it is, and I know a lot of people that are hiring do not believe themselves to be discriminating, do not believe themselves to be sexist, do not believe themselves to be biased in any way, because those biases are they're so subtle.
Most of the time it's actually unconscious.
It is unconscious. Yeah. And so, for example, just a slightly different but related issue.
Sure.
We were talking about sexual harassment in the workplace. And a quick scan of the room, nobody thinks they do it. Nobody thinks it, but genuinely, nobody thinks they do it. Everybody thinks that they know what constitutes appropriate and non-appropriate behavior. I quickly scanned the faces of the women in the room, and nobody said a word. The men were, talking to themselves, thinking like, we don't do this, right? Like, it's not a thing that we do, we know. And every single woman,
Nothing.
Nobody said anything.
Wonder what was going through their heads.
Right? Well, I know what was going through mine. And there's always value to education. There's always value to just having a conversation about it. There is that discomfort that arises as soon as you bring up the topic, right? Especially if there are men in the room and women in the room. Yes. As appropriate as they may be and as respectful as the environment might be, there is always room for education. There's always room for the conversation. There's always room to say, let's have a seminar, let's have a workshop. Let's just say, here's what constitutes appropriate behavior. Here's what's not appropriate behavior. And just because you don't intend it to be inappropriate doesn't mean that it's not.
Absolutely.
And I think those are conversations that need to be had.
Do you think people are ready to hear the conversations?
See, and I may be wrong on this. I didn't think it was an issue to talk about it. I thought, it's happening across the world. You'll switch on the news and we're on the heels of, hashtag Me Too and Balance ton port and all of that. And okay, isn't this the moment to be talking about this? And I think as a communicator, I think there is work to do in order to get people to feel safe to talk about it. And I mean that for both men and women, for wherever you stand on the issue. I think nobody feels safe to talk about it. I think men don't feel safe talking about it. I feel women don't feel safe talking about it. And I think that is where the problem is. Like, what do we need to do in order to create a safe space for people to have these conversations?
Going back on the gender issue, and I always say this, that, we're doing a lot of work in in terms of statutory requirements. The legislation is here, which we're seeing the private sector is, making the effort. But I always link the gender issue also to, no matter how advanced or evolved you are in your professional sphere, if at home you're still expected to be the subservient woman who feeds his man, who brings him his plate of food at the end of every day, to be the perfect mother and the perfect wife.
Absolutely.
What are we doing, guys?
Absolutely.
So that is one aspect that has always particularly bothered me, because it then does seem like we're paying lip service because we're not fixing the root issue.
And I think then you're absolutely right? The problem is, part of the problem is, how does a woman think of herself? How do you see your role? Because if you're going to wait to get to the workplace in order to demand, that you be treated the same, are you treating yourself the same? And I think that's also a conversation that's so difficult to be had. It might be even harder to have that conversation.
I think so. And I think a lot of, as you said, I'm a staunch feminist, so I'm not I don't want to say that women are to blame, but I think that we do have our share of responsibility, because I feel that a lot of the time, and we had Miriam Blim, who's a gender economist, a few months ago on the podcast, and she made a valid point about when she had to, make certain sacrifices. And she said a lot of women would say it's my choice, but then that's a choice their husband never had to make. And that's I think is very profound, because it's easy to say it was my choice.
It is. It's a it's a little bit cop out.
I don't know how we ended up on that issue, but going back on communication, and I'm fascinated with the sort of diplomatic role that you play in trying to bridge public and private sector, which at the end of the day, as one of our guests previously said, they have different stakeholders. So their interests might not always be aligned, and we wouldn't expect them to be completely aligned. Do you think the power of words is important in that sphere as well?
Absolutely. I think, so one of the things that did happen is the COVID years have actually brought those sectors together, having had to rally at a national level to just save people's lives.
Sure.
There's something very primal that comes up in terms of what matters to
Yeah,
us.
the survival instinct.
Survival instinct, but also the spirit of community. It's not just, I think there's the realization that I only survive if everybody else survives too. So I think that did a lot in terms of bridging the gap, as you say, between what we've come to understand is the purpose of the private sector, the priorities of the private sector, and the priorities of the public sector. And in fact, over the last couple of years, public and private sector have actually developed a set of national priorities. There are 4 of them that stands as a guideline for the decisions that are being made, whether at policy level or within the private sector. So I think there has been...
What are they?
The 4 national priorities. So they are opening up to talents and investors. They are looking at the emerging sectors, so things like healthcare, pharmaceuticals, ocean economy, and things like that. There's the talent retention and attraction, which is a huge thing, and we're talking about it every day now, about the brain drain here.
Yeah.
But also, it's not just about, talent bleeding out of here. It's also, if we're going to compete with countries like Singapore, Dubai, how do we create a work environment that's attractive for international talent? And the 4th thing is our fiscal attractiveness and how competitive and attractive we are to international investment, but also talent on the basis of our
And that
fiscal...
is an alignment between private and public
It
sector.
absolutely is.
Okay.
Yes. There are always differences to work out on how we get there, but there is alignment on what those priorities are. So there is alignment there. But to come back to your question, yes, the formulation, the way in which messages are crafted, we might have different target audiences. The way in which we speak to our audiences is different, and that may clash. But that's what's exciting about my job, man. It makes it challenging to find messages that have more global appeal, more that can appeal to both sets of audiences, that are able to convey the priorities behind those messages in a way that speaks to everyone. Tall order. It doesn't always happen. But no, there's room for it, and there's room for talent in it as well. But I think what's helping is the fact that you can have a dialogue. Like if you find the right people to talk to on both sides, then there's the bit where you speak your message, but there's also the bit where you listen to the other message. And I think there are instances where I see that happening without,
But that's a good thing, and it's wonderful to hear because, and as you said, that there's a silver lining in everything. Perhaps if COVID hadn't happened, you might still be quite far away from each other. But I wanted to touch on the brain drain, which is something I've discussed with at least half of the guests that have come here. There's no magic potion, there's no magic solution. It is something that I think worries everyone, including government. And that's great that this realization has sunk in. Do you think effective communication might help to retain them here?
There's only so much that the words will do. Yes, I think there is a dimension where all we do and all we have the potential to do and all that we can offer is not visible. It's not necessarily seen. It's not appreciated. We don't necessarily use those things well in order to make ourselves attractive. But I think it's just the tip of that iceberg. I think if there is a problem of brain drain in this country, but also everywhere. I mean, the mobility of labor is today what it is. But, young people like yourself, we've traveled all around. You've chosen to come back. A lot of people haven't. I think we need to be clear also that it's not a problem that is so specific here. It's just
It's because we're small, we feel it more.
We do feel it more.
Yeah.
We do feel it more. But the, ease of travel, ease of moving jobs, just like how mobile labor has become is a reality of the world that we inhabit. Now, we do feel it a lot more strongly because, we're a very community-based kind of environment, and we feel it when our sons and daughters are away. But had we been more of an urban center with just young people coming in and going out, we wouldn't have felt it as much. It might have been, a similar sort of reality, but we might not have felt it as much. I think it's all about the framing of it. I think we can either choose to see this as brain drain, as all of our best talents are leaving this country, or we see ourselves as part of a wider global phenomenon that's happening, and we either ride that wave or we don't, which is why one of the priorities that have been set out is the retention and attraction of talents. How do we make ourselves attractive to people like yourself who've come back? But what made you be attracted to London to go and spend some time over there? We should be able to do that. And I think our size doesn't play against us here. I think the fact that we're a lot more agile, we're a lot more nimble, we can move certain industries, and we can provide opportunities here that might not be available in bigger metropolis sort of centers. Yeah. So I think if we flip that problem and we don't see it as we're bleeding out talent, but we're part of a global world where we can attract talents.
Yeah. So we see it as movement as opposed to it's a one-way.
Exactly.
Outflow. Yeah.
I mean, and I've worked in African Leadership University, where 90% of our staff at the time was international. People want to come and work here. They do want to come and work here. It's an attractive place to work at the get-go. Like, who doesn't want to live by the beach and get a decent salary and be safe? Of all the places you could be in Africa, this is by far one of the safest. We have the advantage of being kind of like at that crossroads of cultures, between East and West, between Africa and Asia. We speak all the languages. It's a great place to be. I've had friends from the States, but also from the continent that have been here and who've thought, this is a great place to raise kids. It is a great place to, you and I raise kids here. It's a good place to raise kids. There are a number of elements that make this country attractive. But we have to be deliberate about it. We have to have a deliberate vision and a deliberate strategy to attract those talents here. And it's not just a question of giving them the good jobs. It's a question of giving them the good live, work, play environments. Like, are you going to shut down all the restaurants and all the bars at 11 and then there's nothing else to do? Are you going to provide healthcare and education in a way that, will attract more and more people? Do we open up? There's also a very specific cultural aspect of Mauritius.
Yeah, I agree. I think traditionally we've been quite, and I don't mean this in a bad way, I think, as you said, it's cultural, we've been quite protectionist. When we compare Mauritius to Singapore, for example, I think it's time to say, Dr. Sitterland said this in the previous episode, that, when you look at the 70s, the 80s, other countries, particularly England, but other countries welcomed Mauritians with sort of open arms. We should do the same.
We should.
Yeah.
We don't necessarily is the point. And this is just anecdotal, but I thought this was an interesting observation when I was working with a number of expatriates, and they came in bigger numbers. And they could have had a little community off on their own, which is what they ended up doing. But they didn't. That's not what they wanted. They wanted to interact with Mauritians. They wanted to know, okay, what do you do on a Friday night? What do you do on a Saturday night?
Let's hang out.
Let's hang out. And the thing is, the Mauritians, we were just like, oh, but that's family nights. And oh, but no, but I have an actual life. And there's that it is cultural, but it's just, I think maybe we're in transition. We want to get to a certain place. We're also quite attached to the way that we've always been. Yeah. There might be a third way to do this, but I think the realization that we should be opening up our arms a little bit would go a long way.
And I think we, at least in terms of legislative measures, we are seeing steps in the right direction. Yes. So, for example, reducing the threshold for occupational permit, for example, I think is showing at least an intent. As we've seen in other cases, it's all well and good having the law. You have to implement
it as well. Yes.
Yeah. If you had because we have a lot of young professionals watching us, many in search of their purpose in life. If you had a message for the person who might start thinking about going away, what message would you have for them to, I wouldn't say to get them to stay, but at least to think about when they're thinking about their decision-making process?
Yeah, I don't think the purpose is to get them to stay. I don't think that's what it should be. But I think at any given point, a young professional needs to do what's best for them. And in that, you would assess what's good and what's bad in all of your different options. And I think the thing with Mauritius is that it gives you a kind of platform and visibility and a field of opportunity because of our size that you wouldn't necessarily have somewhere else. You and I have both been, at some point, we're lost in London. You know, it's a big city with all of these things happening around you, and you as an individual can very easily get lost. This is a place where you can actually be seen. You can be seen, you can build. And because we are not that old, because we are still very young, because we're still very dynamic and very vibrant, there's so many opportunities here that can be available to a young person that would not be available to them elsewhere. It's a question of finding those opportunities and using them. There's so many, you know, we have the best of Africa in that sense. The opportunities for entrepreneurship here are actually quite significant. And you have a fairly, relatively speaking, a fairly nimble environment that can allow you to do some things that you would jump through hoops to do in a bigger place. I think this place is rife with opportunities, but I think it's a question of seeing them. And yes, there's a lot of work to do in order to facilitate that, in order to make it available. But that's work to be done by those very people.
Yeah, we can't just kind of sit back and expect the opportunities to come to us. And I think it's also, as you said, the part of it is also in our DNA, because as Mauritians, and I'll say it in Creole, nous comptons tracer. So I think, you know, we should use that and build on that. But as you said, it doesn't mean there isn't a lot of work to be done. But I think we should take responsibility and accountability for our own future.
Absolutely.
Last question for you, completely unrelated to what we've been talking about, because I want to come back full circle and our shared love of literature. To this day, who is your favorite author and why?
I'm always torn when I'm asked that question.
Have you changed over time?
I've so changed. I've changed. Oh my God, so many times. I've been through Salman Rushdie. I've been through Toni Morrison. I wrote a full dissertation on all of her works. I've been through Vladimir Nabokov, because I think Russian writing, it's like, I think on certain levels, I think nothing.
Have you ever read any of Elif Shafak, the Turkish writer?
Yeah, I did once, and I can't remember which one.
40 Rules of Love, maybe?
No, not that
okay.
one. No.
Okay.
But yes, for a while, that's the only kind of thing that I was looking for, just like post-colonial writing. The one that I like at the moment is Mohsen Hamid, who wrote The Reluctant Fundamentalist, and he's written a number of books since then. So I'm kind of reading that. My guilty pleasure is Alice Walker. So the Color Purple. I think this whole idea of women's writing, but also very personal, like Alice Walker, Zora Neale Hurston, the women that have been able to write pain and torture.
I'm rereading Maya Angelou at the moment.
Right? Yes.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Okay.
And make it easier for you. Desert Island. Verna has her water, her daughter, and one book.
And one book.
One book.
Just the one book. The Color Purple.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fair.
Yeah.
All right. Wonderful. Well, I encourage everyone to read it because it is a wonderful book. And the film, of course, is pretty amazing too. Thank you, Verna, for your candor. You know, I know we haven't touched on the easier subjects, but as you say, there has to be a place and a voice where people feel safe to talk about things without it being controversial. But, you know, everyone may have their opinions, and that's absolutely fine. Doesn't mean we can't have healthy discussions and talk about difficult subjects. I think they're important. Not everyone has to agree with us. So
Absolutely.
there you go.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.